Hey folks, week 5. We're a quarter of the way through the semester. And with that, we are done with our first book, a whirlwind 2,000 plus year tour of how historical research and writing has changed, all crammed into a couple weeks of reading. What are the inflection points? What are the things you really need to know about historiography from this book? There's a lot of detail. There's way more in the book you could possibly absorb in one reading. Very quick highlights. Herodotus and Thucydides, the founders of history, they're interested in a historical truth. That's a very important ideal for them. They don't figure out how to get it. They don't have any methods that we really continue to use. They had their own idea of truth, which is different from every group of historians we've looked at since then, including us. So it's not that they gave us the answers of how to do history, but the idea that they're trying to do something with historical truth. That's very important. I'm going to talk a lot about that later on in this video. Then after that, we get more Greek and Roman historians looking to the history of empires, the histories of empires, to understand and justify their place in the story of civilizations. Where are they on the timeline of the rise and fall of civilizations? These get replaced by Christian histories that represent very different senses of time, cyclical versus linear time, and so on. And we have medieval writers of history. We looked at the chroniclers and people who wrote just down that there's a flood and this person died and so on. But we also have the medieval monks, the clerics, who are writing histories of a much broader range of people. As the Roman Empire sort of became more diverse and geographically expanded and dissolved at the same time, there's a lot more people to bring into this universal Christian history. So we see this new kind of history that's not strictly a Christian chronology, but incorporating sort of the remnants of the Roman Empire as time went on. Early modern humanists, following in their footsteps, continue to broaden out what they consider to be useful studies of history, but now they're focusing really on source criticism. They're going back to the archives, everything they can find to understand the past and to emulate their heroes. Thucydides, Herodotus, Livy, Cicero, all of these Roman and Greek writers that we saw mentioned early on in Popkin. Early modern writers are trying to emulate them, go back to the sources, add fontes, find out what people really said, restore the classics, and transcend them, ultimately, and write histories, very close integration with history and politics in the early modern period, even more than we've seen elsewhere, but it's happening throughout. Enlightenment historians, again, building on what early modern humanists were doing, focus on history as a story of universal progress, bringing in more and more people, bringing in more cultures, but seeing all these cultures sort of on a chart of getting up to a very Eurocentric view of Enlightenment ideals, and everyone can be charted sort of where they are on that journey. 19th century, mid-1800s, we see Leopold von Ranke's efforts to make history more scientific and report on objective truths about the past. Sounds good. Remember, this whole effort was in the interest of promoting and justifying and documenting German nationalism and supporting its cultural autonomy from France. Ranke's effort, all the things that he stood for in terms of creating a discipline of history, source criticism, academic journals, peer review, the seminar for graduate students, all these things are still central to the history profession. It's changed in some ways, of course. We've seen that over the last few weeks, but many of his innovations in terms of how history should be approached are still with us. And most importantly, the history became a pursuit in its own right. It became something people wanted to do as part of the academy, as a profession. It had its own legitimacy that wasn't part of philosophy or literature and so on. So that's it, Popkin in a couple minutes. What should you take away from that list of inflection points? If you only remember that from Popkin, that's great. That's a good list. But what do you do with those things? 3 points, and 2 right away and 1 later. First, if you've ever doubted that history is political, hopefully you're now convinced after Popkin that it always has been political, and there's no reason to believe it's not always going to be political. Every author, every historian, every work mentioned in Popkin has an agenda. It's related to empires. It's related to a state. It's related to a particular group of people. It's related to progress. It's related to nationalism. It's related to something. It has a purpose. Historians are writing for a reason. It's not just to say things about the past. There's some other broader purpose. Those are always changing, but they're always there. Sometimes they're very much in your face. Sometimes books are obviously very political. Other times it's not as obvious, but it's always there. Number 2, history is always being reinvented. The past is being continually reinterpreted to fit whoever's writing it. Everything we've looked at, again, every single book, every single historian mentioned throughout Popkin's book, about 2,000 years of historiography, is using the past to explain the present and to chart the future. And sometimes you look to the past and say, look, we've done it this way. We need to keep doing it this way. Other times you look to the past and say, look, this has been a disaster. We need to stop. This is horrible. This is unjust. This is wrong. We need to go a different direction. So whatever you're using history for, there's still a use of the past to map out the future. And that's always changing, whether you're in ancient Greece or Rome, medieval, pre-modern, early modern, Enlightenment. It's always being reinvented. It's also important to note that all of these examples that we looked at in Popkin show that our histories now, we see ourselves as the pinnacle of history, right? We're doing it better than anyone ever has. We can forget about objectivity and truth for the moment and say we have more histories, more voices. This is a great thing, and it absolutely is. Down the road, just like we're looking back at these historians and saying, okay, I see why they did it that way. Okay, I understand. Good effort. Nice try. Here's how we do it now. We are a blip on the long historiographical timeline, just like everyone else we just read about. And historians later, maybe 20 years, maybe 10, maybe 100, whatever the range is, they're going to look back at our histories and they're not going to be true. They're not going to make sense in the way that they do for us because we have different reasons for writing our histories now. And you can see that when you get all of historiography, all of the writing of history in a small little book, you get to see these two things, right? It's highly political all the time. It always has an agenda. It's always being reinvented and reinterpreted, and that process is not going to end, and it certainly doesn't end with us. Okay, that's the pre-modern history of history. What should you take away from the changes in the history profession and the discipline within the last century, the last couple chapters that we've been reading about? Excellent summaries in the discussion board. If you're unclear what you should take away, go click through some of the posts. You'll get the list. I mean, everyone did a pretty good job, so I don't need to rehash those things. The one point I want to emphasize, though, what's the effect of the last 100 years or even 50 years, 60 years of history? The destabilizing effect of postmodernism. Popkin explains postmodernism well enough, I think, but he doesn't really explain much about modernism. And it's a little harder to see what postmodernism is without modernism, so let me just do that for 1 second here. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's a general sense that humans were harnessing technology for the better. Industrialization was booming. Everything's becoming more efficient. Factories are churning out products. Economies are doing well, creating more jobs, feeding more people. Political stability after all the turmoil and the spring of nations in the mid-19th century. So the future was as rosy as it had ever been. World War I. Catastrophic fighting, death, destruction. Technology wasn't so great after all. World War II, ditto. Cold War, Vietnam, civic unrest, civil rights, protests. We got a lot of that stuff in Popkin. I think he does a good job of showing the cultural background, at least in the US. We also have, on sort of a global scale, decolonization underway. Many countries coming out from under the heel of colonial and imperial powers and starting to create their own identity and their own history. And thinking about what a history looks like outside of a colonial lens is really difficult. We'll read about that a little bit more later. Tremendous social change, seemingly everywhere around the world. It was in the late 60s and early 70s, in result of all these changes all over, when a Western intellectual movement, eventually known as postmodernism, really took hold. And this really was a destabilizing and a decentering of cultural consciousness. You couldn't just think about your own values in your own country anymore. You really had to understand yourself in relation to everyone else. And we've kind of seen this a little bit in the early modern period and sort of imperial expansion. We saw a little bit in the 19th century, but especially in the second half of the 20th century, the globalization, it's a different world, and it's a different way of understanding your place in it. As a result, one of the main features of postmodernism is a rejection of metanarratives, the kind of universal histories that we saw in the medieval period with the Christian church, that we saw in the early modern period, trying to rekindle the classics of Greece and Rome, that we especially saw in the Enlightenment story of the human progress. These metanarratives just crumble. People couldn't stomach the idea that you can explain all of these different countries, all of these different nations, cultural groups under sort of one master narrative of humanity. Everybody had their story. Everyone had their history, their customs, their values. So this long history of writing history in these sort of grand narrative styles is gone. Postmodern thinkers described knowledge claims and value systems as socially and culturally determined. There was no best way. There was no right way. Everyone had their own way, and they're all fine. They're all products of individual political, historical, and cultural discourses and conversations. Postmodernism also embraces the idea that what constitutes truth is constantly shifting. Not only do different cultures and different societies create their own truths about themselves and their relationship to other people and the planet, but each one of these truths is constantly evolving as that group changes as well. As we've been reading recently, from the mid-1960s, mid-1970s, and moving forward as well, but that's kind of where the genesis was, the linguistic turn, the so-called linguistic turn in history and many other fields, as part of the postmodernist movement, asked how much historians can know about the actual past. How much can you really know what actually happened, to borrow Ranke's phrase. Jacques Derrida, one of the most famous postmodern linguists, said in 1976, there is nothing outside the text. Which sounds weird because it seems like there's a lot of things outside the text. But his point was, there's a reality, okay? But everything we do with each other, everything we communicate, whether it's through images or film or oral histories, spoken words, written text, obviously, everything is mediated through these words and through linguistic constructs. We all interact in the physical world, but what we talk about is all mediated through language. There's nothing outside of that. I mean, it exists, but we can't really talk about it because we have to use words that have certain meanings and different meanings to everybody. Historians can't, by this rationale, historians can't know about the past. They can't know. All they can know about is the text in front of them, the documents, the archives, whatever they're using, photographs, oral histories, think text very broadly, but everything is just stuff in front of them. There is no past to access. Very few things get saved in the archive, as you're well aware. So they don't know anything about the past. The only thing they know is about the text and what people have said about those texts, what other historians have written. That's all history is, postmodernists would say, a conversation about the past. People come in and go out of that conversation over time. And what people want to talk about in that conversation, the conversations that constitute history, is what's going on around them. So when you think about history as an ongoing conversation about the past, and what the past is and what it means, Popkin's given us a really decent picture of what that conversation has been like and how much it's changed over a long period of time. The idea of there being a capital T truth doesn't make sense in history. I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion of does truth exist. That's for a different class. But in history, there can't be a capital T truth. We've already kind of seen this. Hopefully it sounds familiar after the last couple of weeks of reading. So the ideals of objectivity and historical truth, so valued by Ranke and the 19th century historians, and the emerging discipline of history, seem increasingly absurd to postmodernists. Now, not everybody in the 1960s and 70s or later thinks they're a postmodernist. A lot of people reject this idea that you just have the text. A lot of people reject these ideas that there is no truth. So it's not universal, but it's certainly affected, as we've seen in Popkin, and we'll see more as we go through the course, it certainly affected the way historians thought about what they were doing and how they did it. Hayden White, who you read about, was instrumental in encouraging historians to consider how much fictionalizing went into historical narratives. How historians had to make a lot of assumptions about what people were doing and thinking and feeling in order to make a functional story, in order to tell something about the past in a way that would make sense to readers. And he's not the first to do this. We saw Benedetto Croce in 1946 argue about how historians needed a lot of imagination to recreate the past worlds for their reader. White was following in this tradition, but he focused especially on narrative and literary aspects of history. So following in White's footsteps, we can best understand the last half century of historiographical change by thinking about the difference between history and literature. I asked you about this, an extra credit question on a quiz a little while ago. There was a few good responses. Most people followed, I think, a natural instinct to see history as fact and based on documentation, and literature as fiction, false, and free to follow the author's imagination. I wanted to get that question in your head for the readings we did the last couple weeks, when truth and objectivity were being questioned in postmodern thinking. So finally, we're at point 3 of what you should take away from the Popkin book and this historiographical survey we just read. And this is my view. This isn't what Popkin says, but I think this is one reason I wanted you to engage with this book. It tells us that we need to resist the knee-jerk reaction to see history as true and literature as false. All the books that we read about in Popkin, all the old history books, whether they're really old or just, a couple generations old, are they true? Almost no historian would say those older histories are true. Why not? In part because they were written at a different time, and what we value to be true, our methods, what we're interested in, is different. Does it mean that they're false? There's a lot of research. There's a lot of great stuff in those very classic works of history that Popkin's talking about. Again, whether they're medieval or Enlightenment or from 1960, what Popkin is showing us through this huge survey is that the true-false binary doesn't work for history. To uphold this binary that history is true and literature is false suggests that there's not much fiction in history and there's not much truth in fiction. Maybe there can be a little bit, but they really have to stay in their own little categories, right? And neither of those are true. There is a lot of fiction in history. There has to be, for reasons that White talks about, and I mentioned a second ago. You have to create a story. And there's a lot of truth in literature. It's the reason we continue to read literary classics. They say something that's timeless. They say something that seems to be true. It never seems to not be true. We keep coming back to it. To say that there's a lot of fiction in history does not diminish its value, does not make it wrong, does not make it useless. Very much to the contrary. I think it actually makes it better in a lot of ways. Am I saying that there's no truth to history? No. I just want to be real clear about that. But there's a big difference between history as true and truth in history. It sounds pedantic. It sounds very academic. But it's a very big difference, and I want to illustrate that real quickly. We need to think of historical truth on 2 levels. On one hand, we have historical fact. On the other hand, we have explanation of the significance of those facts. And there's very different ways in which we need to think about truth in terms of these 2 things. Historical fact is simple. This person was king, this person was elected president, this battle happened, this side won, these people rioted, they changed this, they increased their wages, this flood happened, and there's things that are just demonstrably true as far as anything can be true in history. And these are trivially interesting. A lot of people take a lot of pride in knowing a lot of historical facts. That's cool. But I think the real value of history isn't in just knowing the stuff that happened, but it's a means to an end. Those historical facts are a means to an end, and the end is understanding how mostly mundane facts add up to something really important. And that's the history that people like. We like interpretations of causality. We like to read stories. This happened, which made this happen, which made this happen, and this other random thing that we didn't at all expect happened, and then together they made this other thing happen, and then the guillotines came out and heads were rolling. It's very exciting. That was basically the French Revolution. They can be broad scales, civilizations rising and falling. They can be small scales, like individual biographies about one person and how they changed in their life. Macro histories, like Braudel History of the Mediterranean, this huge scope. Micro histories, like Carlos Ginzburg's Minocchio and his idiosyncratic cosmology, Cheese and the Worms. So the forms can vary, but the stories are about change. The histories are stories about change and the significance of that change. Fundamentally, they are stories, not just factual reports. No one wants to read that. Any history you want to read is literary. It has a plot. There's a beginning. There's conflict. There's crises. There's tensions. There's hard decisions, consequences. Some intended, some unintended. There's some resolution to these conflicts and crises and tensions. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Usually it's a combination of both. These are literary elements. This is how people write literature. It's how they write fiction. These are literary elements that historians use to help tell the story that they see in the archive. These are fabricated by the historians. You don't go to the archive and see all of these tensions and see all these crises and see the unintended consequences. You have very banal documentation in front of you, and it can be exciting at times. You read personal diaries. Ooh, that was interesting. But you're creating this story from the sources as a historian. Now, that does not mean history is fictitious just because historians are introducing these literary elements. But we have to recognize that it's there, that there is an element of fiction there. There has to be. Otherwise, we'd have just factual reports of what's in the historical record, and nobody wants to read that. They want the larger meaning. They want a story, because that's how we understand information. That's how we internalize it. Historians feel like telling those stories is the best way to communicate the essence of what they're seeing in the archive. So it's not that it's bad for historians to use these literary devices, to have these tensions, to have these resolutions, to have these sort of morals. That's fine. The problem is pretending that historical work is entirely objective or factual, or that your interpretations as a historian are more closely tied to this imaginary past than they are to the sources in front of you. So is history just fiction? Is it all lies? Is there no truth? Is that what I'm saying? No. I'm saying history is a kind of literature. If this seems weird to say, it's because you've been indoctrinated into the Rankian view of history as a largely objective and set of true facts about the past. And that's how almost all of us are taught history. Sure, we can read history books before grade school and so on. There's a limited amount of complexity you can give to, a 10-year-old. But when you're learning history in school, it's in a textbook. It's the factual report. There's a kind of narrative. It's often very nationalist, triumphalist kind of thing. But it's a very straightforward, here are the facts. Here's how you learn it. Now, you have to start somewhere. I think historical awareness, historical consciousness, you need to know World War II happened. You need to know there was a Middle Ages. You need to know basic things about Western history, Eastern history, world history. You need to know basic things, okay? But when that's your first and sometimes your only experience in learning about history, that's what history becomes, a set of facts. That's a very 19th century way of thinking about history. To say that history is literature shouldn't be totally shocking, because we've read Popkin, right? We've seen that up until the mid-19th century, history was considered a branch of literature, a branch of philosophy. It wasn't until Ranke and sort of that effort to make history more scientific where it became really distinct from literature and started to have its own disciplinary identity. And at the time, history could get to historical truth through scientific method. There's no question. And people who were following Ranke and his students and so on, there was no question that you could get to truth. But our ideas about truth and objectivity have changed tremendously since the 1800s. They've changed a lot since the mid-1900s. They've changed a lot since 1990. It's not just that we're adding, when we're doing history, when we're making history, it's not just that we're adding historical facts into our collective historical pocket and just learning more about the past. we're constantly shaping it and reshaping these conversations about the past, adding new voices, new skin colors, new worldviews, new historical experiences. This is all becoming part of history. And when you think about what's truth, when you're looking at history as all these different conversations, it doesn't even make sense to ask that question. Let me be clear that history is not the same as literature. It's a kind of literature, one that grows from archival research. And many of you in your quiz question pointed out there's documents, there's stuff that you have to reference and cite and so on. History is an effort to get right the historical facts and assemble them into a coherent whole and use those to understand change. And understanding change, as I said in my first video, is understanding what it means to be human, or at least trying. Postmodernism asserts that history isn't just facts about the past, but a set of discourses and conversations of the past. This is sound familiar from earlier in this video and other videos. But my point here is that that's exactly what literature is. Discourses and conversations about sometimes the past, but us. It's meant to describe and give insight into people, situations, historical situations. History and literature have the same goals: to give us insight into ourselves that we can't see just by looking around in our day-to-day lives. We need that broader view. Getting back to truth for a second, yes, history is grounded in archival sources. And one could say this makes history truer because we have an external reference point in the archive. We have a set of points. Historians find evidence in lots of places and say, look, this seems to be true. If one person tells you something, you don't necessarily believe it. If 1,000 people tell you something, it seems to have a little bit more weight. It seems to be a little bit truer. But that's kind of what truth is, right? It's people who agree on something. Why do you believe, I should maybe ask, do you believe the Earth is moving around the sun? Do you think that's true? I hope so. But why do you think that? Have you had any experience in your life to lead you to believe that you are moving through space at like 20,000 miles an hour? It was really windy today, so maybe today's not the best day for that question. Do you have any idea that this is happening? If I drop something, why doesn't it go behind me? Like if I was riding a bicycle, if we were really moving through space, like shouldn't there be some indicator that that's going on? You believe it's true that we are. Why is that? Well, because people over a long period of time, experts that we designate to make this kind of knowledge for us, all agree. So we say it's true. But when we're talking about historical truth, we have to differentiate between historical fact truth and historical narrative truth. And they're very, very different. It's easy to agree on the truth of facts. This happened. It's documented here. This person says it. This person says it. It's easy to find historical facts. Narrative truth, unless very simplistic, like there was World War I and there was World War II, and that's a narrative, right? Okay, yeah, sure, that's true. Unless it's very simplistic, his narrative truth in a history book, for instance, can't really be assigned a truth value any more than a truth value can be assigned to a novel. Why belabor this point? Why am I talking about history and literature? Why do I care if you see history as literature? I think our default setting in reading history is to try to internalize the historical facts and the larger story, internalize the meta-narrative, the moral of the story. There's something we should learn. There's information we need to just kind of take on board. We don't read it like literature, which we know is open to interpretation. We know it's ambiguous. We know it's multivalent, suggestive, provocative. We're not asking ourselves, is this true? Did this really happen? It doesn't matter. We don't think of history writing in those terms, being ambiguous and suggestive and provocative. And history works that are sometimes are very controversial because people say, this isn't true. Like, what are you saying? We don't think of history writing in the terms that we tend to read literature with, but we should. Because when we think of history as literature, when we read history as literature, we interpret it, we critique it, we assess its value, we consider its place in the genre. Learning to better critique history writing as we critique literature is one of the main goals of this class. And it's one of the main goals of the Maza book that we're about to start reading. Okay, Maza. We're starting a new book this week. As you've probably seen, it's organized a bit differently than we're used to. There's no long chronological overview that we got with Popkin. It's organized around questions that any critical readers of history, that's you, should be asking any history you read. Each chapter is dedicated to a particular question. We're starting with history of whom and history of where this week, and these will be really useful for what we're doing next week. It's really focused on the last century, so it seems very current, reframing a lot of the issues that we've read about in the last couple of weeks. So I think there's some very helpful repetition. There's a lot of stuff in Popkin. It's hard to know what's really important. You'll get a sense of what's important because you'll see it again in Maza, but you won't feel like you're reading the same thing. It's presented so differently. There's a good reason we're reading it after Popkin, because it's much easier to appreciate all of these changes that she's describing in the last century or so after getting that long historiographical overview that we just had. You have a couple of reading reflections this week, one for each chapter, pretty straightforward. You have a quiz on this video, and that's your workload. Assignments this week are to answer the title questions. Who has history been about? Where has history been about? How has history writing changed on these points? And what ideas in the chapter made you think about history differently? Have a good week. Talk to you soon.